Bentrovati a tutti, questa è la 31esima edizione di Noirin Festival. Domani cominceremo il festival a Milano fino al 15 dicembre, ma oggi abbiamo l'onore di in anteprima aprire il nostro festival con una grande scrittrice e una grande italiana, scrittrice e giornalista. Saluto Laura Lippman, collegata con noi da Baltimora. Hello, Mrs. Lipman. Thank you for being with us. E saluto Anna Rita Briganti, giornalista,
Ciao, ciao a
scrittrice,
tutte e a tutti.
collegata anche lei da molto più vicino, perché siamo appunto vicini, ma insomma da domani saremo tutti in presenza. Dunque, abbiamo il piacere di presentare oggi a tutti gli appassionati di noir un bellissimo romanzo, La donna del lago, pubblicato, già uscito ormai da qualche mese. Ecco, Anna Rita faceva vedere la copertina, faccela vedere, bellissima, molto stilizzata da Boringhieri, Volatti Boringhieri, di Laura Lippman. Laura Lippman, classe 59, è una ex giornalista, figlia anche lei di giornalisti, e il marito anche è giornalista, un ex giornalista famoso per essere il creatore della serie The Wire. Laura Lippman ha creato un'investigatrice che si chiama Tess Monaghan, protagonista ormai di 10 bestseller. È appunto una scrittrice molto conosciuta, molto venduta. La sua Donna del Lago è in produzione per la Apple, addirittura con un cast come Natalie Portman e Lupita Nyong'o, e Stephen King l'ha definita l'erede americana di Ruth Rendell, niente meno. Siamo con La donna del lago nella Baltimora degli anni 60, una storia di sessismo, razzismo, conformismo che ci racconta quell'epoca, ma ci dice moltissimo anche della nostra, e appunto con Anna Rita Briganti, che di donne forti e di storie di donne forti è specializzata, scrittrice che ha dato alla luce negli anni scorsi un bellissimo libro su Alda Merini, una grande italiana, e adesso sta girando per tutta Italia con un libro altrettanto forte su una donna altrettanto importante, più conosciuta nel mondo, perché sto parlando di Coco Chanel, e tutti sappiamo appunto l'importanza di questa rivoluzione. Quindi grazie a Narita di aver voluto raccontarci Laura Lippman oggi, e ti lascio la parola. See you later and thank you for the conversation. I will ask, I will listen to you, sarò in ascolto della vostra conversazione, ci vediamo dopo. See you later, bye.
See you, thank you so much Marina, thank you so much Laura. In Italian we say Laura, and it's a beautiful name that we love. I speak in Italian for the Italian audience, but we stay with Carla that we thanks for the translation. So from now I'll speak in Italian. Thank you so much Laura. Buonasera a tutte e a tutti, siamo qui come avete capito Baltimora-Milano, Milano-Baltimora, per un incontro molto noir ma anche molto psicologico e molto anima, molto cuore, molto sogni, molto colpi di scena, quindi chiederemo tante cose a questa scrittrice che abbiamo l'onore di avere in streaming, aspettandola in presenza. La prima domanda in tempo di Covid non è retorica, volevo sapere da Laura Lippman o Laura Lippman come sta e come va ora la situazione a Baltimora dal punto di vista del Covid.
I've been very lucky and very grateful for it. Early in COVID, an Italian friend reached out to me probably in February of 2020 and said, I want to tell you how things are here and what's going to happen. And I didn't believe her. And she was so prophetic. So I feel very lucky that I'm healthy. I've had 2 vaccinations and a booster, and everyone close to me is healthy. And I hope that's the same for everyone else. It's been quite a time.
Iniziamo subito quindi a conoscere questa scrittrice con un tema molto sentito in Italia, ovvero quello dei vaccini. È molto bello che lei mi abbia risposto questo, non lo potevo prevedere, sono contenta di questo inizio. Ma ora ci tuffiamo nel lago. È un romanzo pieno di donne forti, a volte meno forti, trasparenti, a volte più ambigue. Iniziamo dalla protagonista, l'aspirante giornalista che si trasforma da casalinga anni '60, siamo nella Baltimora anni '60, in cronista. Vogliamo dire chi è Maddie, per favore?
Maddie Schwartz was inspired by the character Marjorie Morningstar in a novel by Herman Wouk. And it's a novel I reread every year, but it was only upon reading it in 2017, I think, maybe 2018, that I realized that the woman that is seen at the end of the novel through the eyes of a man who yearned for her and never had her, and he sees her as old and grandmotherly, and he is rather relieved that he didn't end up with her because he's a few years younger. And she's only 39. And I had never noticed that. I mean, at 39, I'd barely gotten started as a novelist, and I had so many major changes ahead of me in my life. I would actually end up walking out on my first marriage. And so I began to think about that. And I began to think about how someone from your past can arrive in your life and make you remember what you said you were going to be. What was your ambition when you were young? Are you there? Are you anywhere close to what you wanted or said you wanted? And that was my main concern. I mean, that was what I was going for. I wanted to write this story about a woman who wanted to matter and who wanted to find something that gave her life meaning. And it wasn't my original intent to send her into a newspaper. I'm always nervous about former newspaper people writing novels, because it can get like way too inside and full of details that nobody cares about. But my father was a newspaper man before I was a newspaper woman, and he had died about 4 years before I began writing this book. And I realized that writing a book set in 1966 about a woman who's trying to make it into a newsroom would give me a chance to revisit my father's life, that this was the newspaper he knew. We moved to Baltimore in 1965, and writing this book allowed me to feel very close to my father. And so in the end, it just made perfect sense for Maddie to become a journalist, and to be focused on death. So that's how I started.
Laura, I read just few lines in Italian. Noi conosciamo una scrittrice da quello che scrive, allora con il permesso dell'autrice leggerò pochissime righe di un passaggio che mi ha colpito molto. Da morta sono diventata la donna del lago, una cosa brutta, sfatta, trascinata fuori dalla fontana dopo essere rimasta a mollo per mesi, per tutto l'inverno gelido, per tutta l'imprevedibile molesta primavera, fin quasi all'estate piena. E a nessuno importava nulla, finché non sei arrivata tu, mi hai affibbiato quello stupido soprannome, ti sei messa a bussare alle porte, a infastidire la gente, ad andare in posti dove non avresti dovuto andare. Parla, Clio, la donna del lago. E allora le chiediamo di anticipare a lettrici e lettori anche chi è la donna del lago o chi era.
Cleo Sherwood was inspired by the unsolved, mysterious death of a woman named Shirley Parker. And it was a story that, although I grew up in Baltimore, I didn't hear about until I was working at the newspaper decades later. Because the fact is, in 1966, the mysterious death, not even ruled a homicide, of a Black woman would not have been big news if she hadn't been found in the fountain in the park. We probably never would have heard about her. So I was really interested in that. And around the time I started this book, it happened to be the birthday of the director, writer, Billy Wilder. And someone was circulating his rules for writing on the internet. And I think he might have said, steal smart. He definitely said, grab the audience's attention. And I was like, Billy Wilder had a dead person narrating this story in Sunset Boulevard. Why can't I have a dead person? And it's very important in Lady in the Lake that we hear from Cleo Sherwood. It's important that her voice is the first voice in the book and it's the last voice in the book, because this is a book that's about how the victim can get lost in a murder investigation. And especially whether it's a crime novel or a podcast or long form journalism, it can become about the investigator. It can become about the writer herself. And I really wanted to look hard at that. And I wanted to write a victim, a dead woman, who somehow managed to live in the mind of the reader, even as she was adamant that her life would be closed to those who wanted to poke around and probe and use it for their own purposes. Cleo is young. She's beautiful. She is extremely willful. She has had 2 children by 2 different men, but she still believes in love, and she believes she has found it. And it may be that very quest for love that has led to her being in the lake or not. That's a lot about what the book is. Cleo, more than anyone in the book, sees through Maddie. And to me, the most important line in Lady in the Lake is Cleo, speaking from beyond the grave, says to Maddie in these conversations she has with her in her head, "You weren't interested in my life. You were interested in my death, and they're not the same thing." And that was something, as a crime novelist, as someone who often writes about or is inspired by real life crimes, I wanted to be really clear that we must never lose sight of the victims.
Tanti grandi temi, tanti grandi temi nel suo romanzo. Il primo che affrontiamo subito è un tema molto sentito anche in Italia e in Europa, un'Europa che su questo tema si divide, cioè la questione integrazione fondamentale. Come avete capito, Maddie è di un certo colore, il nostro colore, io non credo nel concetto ovviamente di razza, e Cleo, come ricordava Laura Lippman, è una donna nera, tra l'altro insultata per questo suo colore. Allora le chiedo che ruolo ha il razzismo in questo romanzo.
It's huge. I mean, it's Baltimore in 1966. By the way, if you write about Baltimore in 2021, you still have to write about racism. It's a city that has a majority Black population, but at the same time, it's a city where a disproportionate number of its Black residents are poor, live in violence-ridden neighborhoods, and even as the city has put more and more Black officials in power and politics and in important institutions, it still struggles. Race is such a big part of the story of Baltimore that if I don't write about race at times, then I'm not writing about Baltimore. And I chose the year 1966 very specifically. It started because I knew a lot about the governor's race of 66, which had a lot of uncanny parallels to the presidential race of 2016, with an outsider candidate who was campaigning on a very subtextual racist platform, was not elected. But I was aware of the parallels between those 2 elections. That became very unimportant in the book. But 1966 became huge. And the more I researched 1966, the more I became aware that it was kind of this hinge year where it's the beginning of the upheavals. A lot of people have written about 1968 and 1969. And when we talk about the 60s in the United States, those are the years people are really thinking about. They think about the pre-Kennedy assassination 60s, and they think about sort of the post-Woodstock, Vietnam War era, this, the sinner cannot hold kind of 60s. And 66, which I chose almost by happenstance, proved to be a fascinating year. The one fact, I learned a lot about 1966 researching this book, but the one fact I come back to again and again is that in 1966 in the United States, both of these songs reached #1 status. First was King of the Road, which was sort of an old-fashioned, almost country ballad, certainly country influenced, sort of this nostalgia about what we used to call hobos wandering the highways. And then at the same time, the Rolling Stones song Satisfaction reached #1 in 1966. And I'm like, that's a year in a culture that is changing profoundly. And race it is literally true. It's mentioned in the book that in 1966, when that year begins, Baltimore City Black police officers cannot ride in patrol cars. The only jobs they are allowed are on patrol or on Vice as undercover drug operatives. That changed at the end of 1966, and that was something that's very key to the book. But I didn't bend history to my ends. I let history bend the book to its ends, if that makes sense.
Un romanzo in cui la storia entra nella trama, come ha ricordato l'autrice, è un romanzo molto appassionante che ha tanti colpi di scena, compreso un colpo di scena molto grande. Non ve lo svelerò, però devo per forza chiedere a Laura Lippman, lo diciamo all'italiano, che rapporto ha con i colpi di scena? Quanti ce ne devono essere in un buon noir? Come sceglie dove metterli?
So I go all the way back to Edgar Allan Poe, The Purloined Letter, and I put a lot of things in plain sight. I'm a big believer in playing fair, first and foremost. And one of the things I've realized is that people who read crime fiction are really smart. And they're always engaging with the text. They're always like, what's going on? They always have answers. And so you can kind of take advantage of that. You know that the reader is doing a lot of heavy lifting. And so it really is a lot of Occam's razor. The obvious answer is the obvious answer. And you just I don't think in terms of twist. I think in terms of secrets. And there are things that are secrets, and as they come to the fore, I don't think there's any rule of thumb about how many twists there should be, but however many twists there are, when they happen, they should be at once surprising, but at the same time, it should be like, oh, of course, now I get it. And that's what I'm going for, which is something that in the end, while it might surprise, it feels organic. The biggest twist in Lady in the Lake, which I don't even know how to allude to without giving it away, when you know it, it's like, oh, of course, that explains so much. And it's also in contrast to, there's this other murder in the book that's so relatively straightforward. And it turns out there's one thing we don't know about it, but a little girl was killed and the cops figured out in 48 hours who killed her based on really simple physical evidence. And that never changes. That never changes for the most part. Although again, I just feel like the rule for twists is they must feel organic. And when they happen, they should never be shocking. They should be like, only I looked at it from that point of view, I would have gotten it.
La struttura del libro è una struttura molto diffusa nella letteratura anglofona, ovvero parlano tutti quelli che sono coinvolti in questi delitti, in questa trama, nelle vite dei personaggi, danno il loro punto di vista. È molto interessante ed è anche molto complesso da riprodurre sullo schermo, come ci raccontava l'autrice anche nel backstage. Abbiamo toccato come tema quello della parte noir, abbiamo parlato di razzismo, c'è un terzo grande tema che chiederò all'autrice, ma si parla anche di politica, si parla di amore, si parla di tante cose. Il terzo tema non può che essere il percorso di emancipazione femminile. Abbiamo la protagonista che si ribella a una vita già scritta. Quindi chiedo a Laura Lippman come sarebbe Maddie oggi? Cosa è cambiato da quel 1966 in cui una donna ancora faceva fatica a fare la reporter e tante altre cose, faceva fatica a fare tante cose.
I have to do the math and remember how old Maddie would be today. I think she would be in her 80s. I think I'm right about that. Maybe, yeah, she would be almost 90 years old. So she's almost my mother's age. And it happens that my mother's name is actually Madeline, which is an interesting choice. I think Maddie, and we do get a glimpse of her later in her career at the very end of the book. I think Maddie today, that Maddie had an amazing life. She was very successful. It was so interesting to me when the book was being read by people who wanted to make it into a movie. And one man explained to me that he felt very sorry for Maddie. And it was sad what happened to her. I'm like, no, it's not. She grew up at a time where it was a choice, and she made her choice. She would rather have the big career on a man she sees on the side. She doesn't want to be anybody's wife. She's happy with the choices she made, given from the choices ahead of her. If I'm trying to imagine a current day Maddie, a woman in her 20s or 30s, as it happens, I know a lot of them. I belong to a writers group where most of the women are much, much younger than I am. And I'm watching them struggle, not so much because of sexism, although that still plays a part, make no doubt, but because the job opportunities aren't there. And my heart goes out to them because newspapers are getting smaller. It's just so, I feel like I know a lot of young Maddies, and they no longer feel like it's a choice between career or love. They feel like they can have both of that. What's hard is finding the job that makes them happy, because there are fewer and fewer great writing jobs that come with like stability and health insurance and payments to your pension plan. I feel almost guilty around my younger friends. Last year at this time, I found out that I had a pension from my years as a journalist. I didn't even know I had it. And under finance laws, they had to give it to me as a lump sum. And I said to my friends, I was like, I have a pension. And they were like, what's a pension? And then one said, what's money? So I think today's Maddie is someone who can have a career and can have a personal life, but finding that great career is a lot harder than ever.
Vedo che è arrivata anche Marina. Prima di darti la parola per concludere, però permettimi un'ultima domanda, se posso.
Sicuramente, certo, no, volevo inserirmi poi perché anch'io, sollecitata dalla vostra conversazione molto interessante, ho anch'io una, se non due domande.
Vai ora e poi se vuoi concludi.
No, fai, concludi tu.
Ok,
sì.
Allora concludo la mia parte, poi resto ovviamente per i saluti. È un libro che è perfetto anche per il periodo di Natale, ci apprestiamo a vivere un Natale che speriamo sereno dopo 2 anni difficili, è un libro perfetto per le giornate di festa, per le festività. Allora chiedo a Laura Lippman un augurio per Natale, visto che mancano pochi giorni, e soprattutto per il 2022. Cosa ci augura Laura Lippman?
I wish for the world to go forward and to be able to deal with the reality that's been thrust upon us, and for good health for everyone. And it would be nice if people could be a little less crazy. That's what I wish.
Sì, questa è sicuramente un bellissimo augurio, anche perché di follia ne stiamo vedendo tanta. Io volevo chiedere a Laura Lippman, essendo insomma il Noir Festival un festival che si occupa ovviamente anche molto di cinema, sapendo che La Donna del Lago è anche stato opzionato, anzi è in produzione dalla Apple TV per una serie che addirittura, come ho detto all'inizio presentando questa conversazione, nel cast Natalie Portman e Lupita Nyong'o, insomma volevo sapere da lei se prenderà parte come sceneggiatrice a questa produzione oppure se si tiene in disparte, come si relaziona al mondo di Hollywood, insomma, e delle serie. Ecco. Adesso ormai cinema e serie sono molto integrate nella nostra cinematografia mondiale. Diciamo.
Whenever my work is sold to the movies or television, I make basically the same offer to the producers and the writers, which is I'm available to the extent that you need me. I don't want to be in a writer's room. My life doesn't make that possible. I have a small child. So I think of myself as kind of a consultant. And, you know, one example is on Lady in the Lake. They really wanted to expand the part of Cleo so it would attract a major star like Lupita Nyong'o. And they said, can you point us to more information about the real life inspiration for this person? And I said, there's really not. I said, but even though the sections on Cleo are short and she doesn't have a lot of time on the page, I'm going to write you her full biography so that you can really see that this is a major character. I just made choices as a novelist not to give her a lot of page time. And so I did something, I wrote basically this memo, which is this is a major part and here's all the stuff that Cleo does in her life, even if you don't, see it in the page counts. So I'm always there. I'm always like, call me, email me, ask for my ideas, ask for my feedback, or don't. I'm really very laid back about it. I think I've seen a lot of television made. I know more about television than the average novelist, way much more. And so I know that it's really hard work and that it's very different work. And it's teamwork. And teamwork is not one of my great strengths. I'm very selective.
I guess, Laura, that you were mentioning your husband's experience on The Wire. I think it affected the family too, and I can imagine. So I just wanted to ask you the last question, if Anna Rita allows me. Se Anna Rita mi permette, volevo chiedere un'ultima domanda prima di lasciarvi. I will ask you in English. I think it's also this. This is the question: is this character of Maddie also shaped on your personal experience since you worked in the journalism? And I've read that you switched on the writing also because you were not very satisfied of this work. I don't know if it's true. Can you tell us something about this? If there is some of your personal experience in this tale of the book.
Does Carla need to translate first, or should I just jump right in?
Devo tradurre, Marina?
No, perché sottotitoli. No, doesn't need.
Okay. So I'm younger than Maddie, and I entered newsrooms in the 1980s as opposed to the 1960s. But I worked alongside a lot of the women who were first. So Maddie is very much influenced by and a tribute to the women who were the true trailblazers. Certainly, even coming into journalism 20 years after Maddie, I experienced a lot of sexism. I went through a lot of things in newsrooms that would not be tolerated now. And one of the hard lessons that I've had to learn is that having survived a really tough workplace is not a badge of honor. I mean, I think there's a tendency for women my age to look at younger women and say, you don't know how tough we had it. But that is, for want of a better word, a very ableist way of seeing things, which is to say, just because you survived a horrible situation doesn't mean that should have been the norm. And it doesn't mean that you're somehow better than other people. So, you know, in terms of the way I was treated by my male colleagues, sometimes it was better than 1966, but not that much better. In terms of the way I was treated by some of my male sources, yeah, I had a lot of material from my own life to pull from Maddie. I always wanted to be a novelist. That was always the goal. And I was always working toward that goal. I was forced out of journalism by one really bad boss who was not, it wasn't a problem of sexism or Me Too. It was just, he didn't like me and he was making my life a living hell. So I was like, okay, time for me to go. And luckily that happened right around the time that I started supporting myself as a novelist. And it was the best thing that ever happened to me. If that boss hadn't been so mean to me, I probably would have tried to stay and sort of have it both ways and be a reporter and be a novelist. And I think, this just sounds obvious, I think getting the opportunity to be a full-time novelist helped me grow a lot as a novelist, and it made me more ambitious and more experimental. There's no way that the young woman who left the newspaper in 2001 could have written a novel like Lady in the Lake. I needed like another almost 20 years to get to a level of doing something with that many points of view and that level of experimentation. So yeah, it is kind of based. That is kind of true. Yeah, I definitely got out. Yeah.
Insomma, è una vera guerra, quella dei sessi che continua ancora oggi. Anna Rita Briganti ne sa qualcosa, essendo una giornalista e una giovane donna che combatte la sua guerra come tutte noi. Dobbiamo chiudere, naturalmente vi ringrazio tutte e due, però prima devo dare un'informazione, e cioè che Laura Lippman tornerà anche l'anno prossimo, ad aprile del 22, prossimo aprile. Bollati Boringhieri pubblicherà un nuovo romanzo, La ragazza dei sogni, quindi l'aspettiamo con ansia. Laura Lippman, I know that from the publisher that the next spring, in April 22, will come out La ragazza dei sogni. The title in English would be The Girl of the Dreams, or I don't know. Will be published, yes. And just to know if you were inspired by the lady on the girl, the woman on the lake from Billy Wilder, Sunset Boulevard, did you have another inspiration for this new book in film or not?
For Dreamgirl, Dreamgirl, it was actually inspired by 3 novels. Misery, but Misery also has an amazing film version. One of the Philip Roth novels, Zuckerman Unbound, which is very much about when does a fan become a stalker. And finally, there's this criminally unknown novel called A Novel Called Heritage that I definitely stole from this. I mean, like, been really honest about it. I was like, oh yeah, I stole the twist from there. You know, maybe more people will read it now. But yeah, those 3 books together came together. Oh my gosh, I'm about to lose my power. I got to plug in really fast. Oh. It's like I'm about to go out. Sorry.
We are ending anyway, so. If you want to close, I don't know if you.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah, it's so Dreamgirl is inspired by Misery, Zuckerman Unbound, and A Novel Called Heritage. And it's about the most opposite of the Lady in the Lake had 22 characters, big sprawling plot, historical background. Dreamgirl takes place in one writer's mind when he's stuck inside his apartment in what will prove to be sort of like the last pre-pandemic year. And it's all inside his head, and it's the most claustrophobic novel I've ever written.
Okay, don't tell us more because we want to open the book and to discover. Thank you very much, Laura Lippman, for having with us this wonderful chat. I thank you very much. Your book, it was absolutely a discovery and a beautiful book. So I can't wait for the next one. Grazie a Narita Briganti.
You're welcome.
Narita. Io vi do appuntamento a domani per l'inizio del festival con la presentazione dei 5 finalisti del premio Scerbanenko. Ci vediamo?
See you in real life. Bye.
Bye. Thank you so much.
You're welcome.